Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to special business meeting for council on Tuesday, May 7th. Squamish, please fill it up. Squamish, Squamish. Welcome to Squamish Nation Traditional Territory. What a beautiful day it is to be inside the windows. That's why we do this job. Motion to approve the agenda. Moved by Councilor Stoner, seconded by Councilor Herford. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries. On staff reports, it is audit season and we are joined by our auditors. Mr. Fox and Mr. Fripp are here with our CFO, so I will hand it over to you, Ms. Mathews, to start us off.
Thank you, Mayor Elliott. Yes, I'm Christine Mathews, Chief Financial Officer. With me is Bill Cox, Senior Partner for BDO Canada, and Paul Fripp, Manager of Senior Partner, or partner of Insurance and
There's been a few title changes this year. Yeah, no, I'm a partner in the Whistler office, and I've been working with Squamish for quite a few years now.
So first off, before we go any further, I would very much like to thank BDO and their two teams, both in the Vancouver office and the Whistler office. To say that this has been a challenging year end would probably be an understatement. And to be frank, they got financial statements from us way too late to actually be here today. But their teams really went above and beyond, literally working evenings and weekends to try and get us here. And so we really appreciate their commitment and dedication to us meeting this legislative deadline. Thank you. Just to give you a rough idea, why was it such a tough year end? Well, we went live with a new system right before we went into our year end. And it's a great system. I don't want to disparage it by any stretch, but it certainly had some learning curves. And our core accounts payable team and all of the managers now starting to do automated invoice workflow had a very steep learning curve in a time when we already have very high invoicing levels as we try to wrap up for fiscal year end. That put us a little bit behind. On top of that, not all of our reports were fully developed, and unfortunately some errant information came out of the systems that we had to go back and try and pull together and get some statements that were properly working. So a couple little glitches for us, but again, BDO has really gone above and beyond to help get us here today. Just a quick, we are still doing just-in-time orientation for council, so I won't spend a lot of time on this as I know you've had a super busy day. But we will just remind you that financial statements are due under Community Charter by May 15th. And our fiscal year end is required to be December 31st. After we leave here today, hopefully Council accepts and approves our financial statements. BDO will continue to do a subsequent review, and hopefully we'll have all of this brushed up, finalized, and ready to submit to the ministry on time. Section 171 does require that your municipal auditors attend annually and speak to you about the year end, and I will turn that over to these gentlemen very shortly. But I did want to take an opportunity to just run you through some of the quirks and quirks of municipal accounting and the District of Squamish in particular. Some of the complications in preparing our financial statements include that we had 3 and now have 2 entities that we consolidate into our statements. The Squamish Sustainability Corporation and the Squamish Public Library. Because they're also embedded in many of our records, because we also provide services to them, that requires that we both bring them in or add them to our statements, but then also do quite an exercise of elimination to get them back, the various components where we're doubling up information to eliminate those as well. On top of that, we have an aquatic center, which actually we don't technically own. The regional government owns it. We operate it on their behalf, so again, we have to disentangle their financial information from us before we present our financial statements, because it's actually presented on the SLRD statements. And then we have minor things like a cemetery care fund, which is considered a trust and that we don't include in our statements. We had a previous chart of accounts that was had gotten old and dysfunctional, so data conversion was a challenge to us this year, and we have to, after we went live, we had to do quite a bit of sorting of financial information into the new structure. So that was a bit challenging, more than usual. And we also had a budget amendment this year, which we have not had for a very long time. And just so that you're all aware, even though we had that budget amendment, it is not presented in these statements. Budget amendments do not get reflected in our financial statements. Only the original budget gets reflected there. So there'll be 1 or 2 variances that you see where we did actually go for a financial plan amendment, but they're reflecting as being a variance in our statements today. In particular, if you don't recall, the variance or the budget amendments included the housing site preparation for the under one roof site. We also had a minor we had a more major emergency expenditure, but we had to tweak the bylaw for another $98,000 worth of capital expenditure at our wastewater treatment plant. I think those are the two major amendments that went through with that bylaw amendment. Most of our reporting through the year is managed under the community charter and complies with our financial plan reporting and budget variance reporting. There are some interesting entries that we make into our general ledger to be able to support that reporting, that when we get to the end of the year, all the accountants love and hate, hate mostly, that we have to deal with and make sure that they don't end up in these statements and confuse the issues. So there's lots of dynamics going on as we try and prepare our financial statements. I'm just going to very quickly walk you through some of the highlights of the statements. I did send in the reports to council a link to our Auditor General report, and the Auditor General does provide some feedback, so if you get really excited about financial statements and want to dig down deeper and find out what does this statement mean and what does it do, by all means have a look at that document. It outlines some key questions you might want to ask as you're looking at statements. So overall, I'll just start out on our statement of our consolidated statement of financial position. It's page 11 of your agenda. It indicates that we have financial assets that exceed our liabilities by $24.5 million, and it's about $1.7 million higher than last year. The non-financial assets or tangible capital asset position has increased about $14 million. And so if you actually were to refer to our net financial assets statement of change in net financial assets on page 13, it would indicate to you that the nature of some of those changes in tangible capital assets, including that we acquired about $17.5 million more in capital assets. We had developers contribute about $3.4 million in capital assets, and we depreciated about $6.8 million worth of our assets. So overall, we had an increase in our overall net asset position. Our accumulated surplus has grown by $15.7 million. It's important to note at this point, and note 12 will help break down for you, that when we talk about accumulated surplus in this context, it is not the same way we discuss accumulated surplus to you in our budget scenario. So note 12 clearly depicts how that breaks down and how our equity for this organization breaks down, and the first component of that note shows you what we actually consider to be our accumulated surplus. And I see Councillor Race smiling over there.
We don't have $278 million.
That has just gone down a little bit, not necessarily because we've been budgeting to use it, but also because we have been doing a little bit more internal borrowing coming into this year end. So we'll be going to borrowing in 2019, and that'll help swing that back a little bit. We have designated surpluses of about $6 million, and reserves or statutory reserves are up about $4.4 million over last year. And you can see that on the Schedule 4 at the very end of your financial statements. It outlines all the reserves that you're currently holding. The consolidated statement of operations on page 12 of your package. Please note that you do have a revised version of this that came on table. Unfortunately, we had to restate two of our expense categories in 2017. This comes back to one or two of those reporting challenges we were facing, and we did discover that late in the game last night. So the general government and the economic and community development for 2017 comparative has been changed on the revised version that you now have. Let's see, what else? We'll notice that we present our statement of operations by breaking up the revenues. The top band of revenues is sort of our general operating revenues. Down below under the other are some of those revenues that are specific to capital and that can really distort the picture. So we reflect those down lower so you get a better sense of how we line up on our operational side. Our operational revenues did exceed budget. Key reason for that is generally we don't attempt to budget our community amenity contributions from developers. And we also had higher building permit revenues of about $511,000 than expected, and our investment revenue was up considerably as well from 2017. On the expenditure side, or on the expense side, our contract services for the police contract and lower debt service basically provide an overall net surplus higher than budgeted. Those are the key factors. Just a reminder that capital revenues, though, that you'll see that they look like they're lower than both budget and our 2017 comparatives. But we really tie those capital revenues to the expenditures that we make. So, for instance, if we are not, we don't pull the whole grant. If we only did part of the grant expenditure, we'd only pull that portion of the grant and match it to the expense that's occurring. You also don't see in here borrowing, transfers from reserves, and other things that fund our capital expenditures. So if you feel like there's a bit of a disconnect between the revenues that we bring in for capital and the capital expenditures that you see on the next page, the reason for that is that some of those entries that we do for financial planning only are not recognized in the same way for accounting. So we actually increase debt, or we and even our capital expenditures are treated as acquisition of assets for financial statement purposes versus source and use of funds in our financial planning report. We've already touched briefly on the net consolidated statement on page 13. The net change in net financial assets. Very basically, this essentially adjusts our annual surplus by eliminating all the things that don't impact the net financial assets of your statements back on the statement of financial position. And then the final statement in the sequence is on page 14, and that's our cash flow statement. And it essentially, again, looks at our accumulated surplus in the context of what really contributed to cash. Without further ado, I think unless council has specific questions on the statements, I'm going to pass it now over to our BDO team to provide some information that they'd like to confirm.
Great, thank you. So you have a letter from us, I think, which has some confidential information there, which we're going to review in the next meeting. So I'm going to give you the high-level overview here, which is very positive. It always pains me to say that because us auditors like to have conflict and newspaper cameras and all sorts of things going on, but unfortunately we don't have any such things at this time. I should mention, Christine was giving us a little praise for helping out with the year-end, which we're happy to do. However, I noticed if you sent Christine an email at 11:45 p.m. at night, you get a response at 11:50 p.m. at night. So she's clearly been burning the midnight oil as well. So sort of a joint effort to get things done, and I'm glad we're here. So even though there was some complications Christine mentioned, I would say overall the audit went very well. Some issues to work through, but nothing of substance or concern on our end. So we are going to be able to sign off a clean audit opinion. You don't have that yet. Christine mentioned how after this meeting we'll go away and finish up. That's the normal process. The auditors cannot complete their work until the financial statements are approved by council. So assuming that they're approved today, we go away, we do our last little bit of work we call subsequent events work, and then we'll come back with our final signed opinion. But we're far enough along, we're 99% along, we're far enough along we know we're going to be able to sign off a clean audit opinion, which is exactly what you want. So bit of work to get there, but very uneventful, good results, full cooperation from all staff, access to all the records we needed. So unfortunately, nothing to complain about on our end.
So you get in camera. Sorry.
And that's the high level overview. We'll talk about some more details later on.
Thank you. Council, any questions about the financial statements? Even questions of clarity if you don't understand why something has changed? Councillor Anderson.
If this may be appropriate for this occasion, there is a passage or a section in the report, note number 10, provision for solid waste landfill. I raise this because we have several solid waste landfills, legacy landfills that is, and one of them has had some incidents of combustion underground. We have fires. These are containing wood waste, and there's been actually 2 different sites within the district. Neither were district-operated landfills, but you can have combustion and fire incidents. I'm just wondering, when we consider the solid waste landfill, whether these legacy landfills are considered. We have our former municipal landfill that was operated between about late 50s to 1980 as well. And I'm just wondering whether there are any liabilities or issues there that have been highlighted or might be highlighted by our engineering department. So my question is, we've got solid waste landfill highlighted here, but we do in fact have several, and there can be some issues with legacy landfills.
Everyone's looking to me. Thank you, Mayor Elliott. I was hoping that Mr. Buxton would be here. The statements only reflect our current landfill.
Right.
I will follow up more with Mr. Buxton to find out what other ones we may be holding, or if there are lands that we hold, absolutely, but I'm not aware of those that are not reflected in the statement.
So the way the accounting principles work, this accounting applies only to landfills that are still working.
I see.
But if there is a liability related to the older landfills, whether that's the Ministry of Environment or if somebody is demanding some remediation or something, that should get captured as well. And I believe nobody's aware of any such contamination at this point.
That's what I'll follow up with Mr. Buxton and make sure, but
Very
we're
good.
not aware of having any legal actions or regulatory pushback on any of our past sites at this point, so I'll have to follow up.
Continue.
If I may, there is also a reference to contaminated sites under note number 2. And it's my understanding that contaminated sites are the most topical example is the Oceanfront Peninsula, but that these are no longer a district liability, is my understanding.
I'm not sure you should look at me.
One of us will answer that. So we have reviewed the SODC lands as part of the contaminated sites review. Our real estate department takes care of that and reviews it with BDO. I was just talking to Mr. Cox about this before the meeting, and perhaps he can expand further. But at this time, we don't recognize it as being a potential contaminated site for us. And I believe because it was in...
Yes. So this is a great day. We got to talk about accounting standards. So the standard for contaminated sites is that it applies to any property holdings you might have that are not in use. So the SODC lands were being held, before they were sold, were being held for development, so that counts as being in use. So they wouldn't fall under the standard. Having said that, though, you can't just sweep it under the carpet if there is a known issue there. So there was, as far as we're aware, no ministry demand or any known liability there at the time that Squamish had ownership. Is that fair to say?
As far as I know, I would have to look to anyone else, but my understanding is no, there's no existing regulatory pushback at this point. Looking at the CAO as well, but...
Well, the developer is also in touch with the province on any last remediation they have to do, so it's actually their problem now.
I would also add that when it was on the books, the SODC lands was measured at fair market value. And so it would have encompassed any negative aspect that remediation would have had on that fair market value. It was already internalized in that value and reflected in the statements that way.
Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Pengel?
Just for my own learning, I understand when we pass the financial plan and the budget, we really have to stick to that, and if we want to adjust, then we need to update a bylaw or go through a process. And I am seeing, some of these line items, there are fair bit of variation from the financial plan. Are those things where we would have had a council discussion, or can you just speak to the room we have to maneuver a little bit within our budget?
Yeah, so generally we are on budget. I think probably the only one that's showing a little bit above our public health, the health, social, and housing through the mayor. We did actually have an amendment on that line, a financial plan amendment on that for the grants that we received from the provincial and CMHC, and we did include that in our amendment. Most of the other ones are below budget, or there's a little bit of variation in some of the revenues. So I'm trying to remember the driver in the economic and development area, but we actually had an offsetting revenue for that piece. And yes, those things are disclosed to council as they come up, wherever
Did you
we're
have a
stepping outside
specific
the key
line,
band.
Councilor Pettengill, that you were looking at where there was a difference?
I was just wondering in general, and it sounds like there was, we can come in under budget without an issue. It's when we go over, and we can earn more than we expected to. It's just when we earn less, that's when there's an issue.
Yes, so through the mayor, generally we're very careful to ensure that our expenditures don't exceed our financial plan authority. And generally that, if there's a situation, sometimes we might use a contingency, like council contingency, where that might be tagged in general government, but it was always intended to do that source. We won't necessarily go back and look for a financial plan amendment in those types of scenarios. But again, please recognize that we did have an amendment as well, and it's not reflected here. So pretty well when I went through anything that was out of sync, there was an explanation for, and council would have been aware at the time that we were either reassigning to a different project or not, or had a grant to offset.
Anything else? Councilor Riss?
Well, on that point, if something is not completed and is carried over, would we see then a lower number? Is that one of the things that would give rise to a lower number?
Yes, our capital projects wouldn't reflect here necessarily other than in the revenue area, but our special projects might. So if they're carrying over, it would show a reduction in our use of operating funding, and that would be then what we do with those ones where we know for sure we're carrying them over, we put them in a designated surplus area for future expenditure, and we pull it back up in the next year as part of the budget process.
On page 14 of the agenda, which is our statement of cash flows, can you explain, so there's, under investing transaction, we had a change in portfolio investments, and 2018 is 43 million, but 2017 is 200,000. And I'm not sure I understand what that line means or what happened there, but it
Looks scary.
It looks very different.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor Elliott, that's really just a case of changing how we're investing our funds. So we used to have a large portion of our portfolio in the bond fund, and that would be considered an investment line. We recently in 2018 moved most of our funds over to a high interest savings notice plan with the Bank of Nova Scotia. In reviewing the PSAS rules, I considered those to be more of a cash and equivalent.
Thank you. Councilor Stoner?
A follow-up question on that point. How do we make those decisions about where we invest and hold the money?
Thank you. Through Mayor Elliott, we don't, we have very restricted confines of how we can and can't invest our funds. It's pretty restricted, and we essentially contact the various organizations that we do work with, and we look for interest values. We try to determine the amount of funds that are available for short and long-term use, and then we make investment decisions based on those thought processes. It's an area where we are definitely need to develop further. I'm not going to, we actually, one of the areas that we're trying to find a staff person who can really take care of the investment piece.
On a broader scale, local governments have been advocating to the Municipal Finance Authority to create ethical funds or ethical investment opportunities, and there was a poll during the last term, and they didn't have quite enough municipalities that were willing to contribute to that fund, but that doesn't mean that that desire isn't still out there. So you'll hear more about that as you're involved in area association and UBCM meetings. Councillor Anderson?
The development cost charges and front-end agreements are discussed on page 29 under note 13, and specifically with reference to the Squamish oceanfront front-ender and municipal share agreements. However, I'm just wondering, when we pass a new DCC bylaw, it is reviewed by, I believe, the municipal auditor or the local municipal, a particular municipal official. And that is an audit process. How is the DCC bylaw and the DCC project fund evaluated during your review that we're discussing today? Because there can be changes, all kinds of risk factors in how a DCC bylaw is managed over time. Is there particular scrutiny given to our DCC accounts in your process?
Okay, I'll speak to that one. The way that we audit developer cost charges is we look at the inflows and the outflows. So in a particular year, we'll have certain contributions from developers related to certain projects. Those are deferred because they have very specific spending requirements attached to them, so they become deferred. And then as the municipality undertakes the projects associated with those DCC funds that meet the criteria of the DCC funds, then they're recognized into revenue. So we look at the revenue that's been recognized in the year against the expenses that were actually incurred. So that's how we're applying the audit process. Specific to your comment on the SODC front-ender agreements, this was a bit sort of outside of the norm. It's a long-term agreement whereby there are potential contractual obligations on behalf of the district over time, which is dealt with under a separate section of the handbook with regards to disclosing contractual obligations in the financial statements. Hence why it was specifically referenced and not your DCCs as a whole.
Through the mayor, I assume it's fair to assume, though, that your job is not necessarily to review the DCC bylaw and whether that's approved. That is done with us in the ministry and through other processes. It's basically my job as your chief financial officer to ensure those reserves are used appropriately, and which we do. We ensure that any project that is being tagged for use from those DCC reserves, we go back and we verify that those DCC reserves made up part of that pricing exercise.
And that the bylaw is reviewed in a timely manner is really between our staff and the ministry.
Correct, and again, generally we leave that to the engineering team to determine when's the right time to go and amend those bylaws. Best practice is generally about a 5-year cycle, but in a time of heavy development, as I understand it, I believe engineering is looking at it now.
My actual interest is that construction prices change over time, and this can perhaps add some risk elements, and whether that would come under the purview of an audit process.
But I think it's fair to say no.
Not in the context of our financial statement audit.
Thank you.
But certainly why we might accelerate the review of our DCC bylaw.
But I guess since I looked like I was going to say something, one of the so the answer is, the short answer is no, but I'm not very good at short answers. Maybe I should have been a lawyer. We work with a lot of we work with a lot of local governments. So one of the things we like to bring to the table is some best practice ideas. So strictly speaking, from our audit point of view, if the bylaw says X and you collect X and you spend it in the right area, we're fine. However, if you hadn't had regular reviews of your DCC rates and projects and all the good things that go in the rate setting, that would be the kind of thing we would bring up and say, hey, we can still give you a clean audit opinion, but just so you know, it's a good practice to review these things every 5 years, if that wasn't happening. So, so it's not officially part of the audit, but it's the type of comment we would bring forward if we had any concerns there.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Seeing none, motion to go into close. Moved by Councilor Stoner, second by Councilor French. All those in favor? Opposed, motion carries.